Charlotte rose from her seat slowly, turned around and made for the bar. Sean followed her closely. They delved into the fridge, which was packed full of both domestic and foreign beers. As she reached forward, she realized that her hands were shaking. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. She asked Sean, who was standing over her, what she should get. "Any shit will do," said Sean. She grabbed 4 bottles of the domestic stuff and carried them back to the table. Sean did the same. They both made one more return trip before Charlotte sat back down, and Sean once more stood behind Martin, who remained seated. "Anyone got a bottle opener?" said Ben. "Indeed," Martin replied. He opened his beer before handing it to Gary. "Pass it around, Gaza, mate," said the ringleader. He took a swig of his beverage and raised his gun, as if to inspect it. "What do you want?" said Daniel, finding his voice. Clamp began. "Oh, this is my friend Benny Boy, by the way. Even though I assume he's already introduced himself, I thought you should know he is indeed one of us and not one of you," he continued. "Ben is going to be standing guard outside for the duration of the evening to make sure we are not rudely interrupted. But finish your beer first, mate, no rush." "What do we want?" "We want to catch up on old times. We want to have a bit of a laugh and a giggle with our old mates from the class of '97. What have you been up to, Dan? You remember me, don't you, bud? I remember you. Kind of a queer sort. Had Alex here as something of a bodyguard, didn't you?" Ben got up and made for the door as Alex sat with fists clenched under the table. Martin now stood up and turned his attention elsewhere. "Paul Henderson, as I live and breathe. A living reminder that in this world you don't have to be smart to make it big. Just kidding, mate. You've done alright for yourself, ain't you? Come on, you Brewers. I reckon I could have been a footballer if my old man had encouraged me a bit more as a kid. Unfortunately, he was a bit preoccupied with a crack pipe. Still, he's in a better place now. Taking a dirt nap, he is." He paused momentarily before carrying on with a burst of energy. "You know what? Fuck it. New policy. If you fancy a smoke, go ahead. There ain't no fucking smoking ban in here tonight. I'm having one anyway." At this invitation, Elaine, Joanne and Rebecca all reached for their cigarettes. All were shaking and having great difficulty coming to terms with the situation. Sean lit what looked to be a roll-up, but it became obvious that it was a joint as the smell of hash hit the room. No one was going to object under the current circumstances. "I've been doing a lot of soul-searching recently," said Martin. He continued. "I'm a man with no real prospects, you see. I've been fucked over again and again, kicked down and told to know my place. So I've had to do some serious thinking. And having done that, I've come to some rather serious conclusions. Life is a pile of shit is the first of these. Secondly, it's clear that the system is rigged in favour of cunts like you lot, tossers who play the game and suck the cocks of your masters. See, people like me, we can't win in this game. So we have to make up our own game. That's sort of what tonight is about." Martin sat back down and paused for a moment before shouting, "Tonight, you are in my house." Gary was something of a sadist. He was taking great pleasure in seeing the looks of horror, and indeed terror, plastered across the faces of his captives. He had been in and out of correctional facilities since his youth. He had actually come to appreciate many of the aspects of being incarcerated. At the top of the list was the feeling of community that came with prison life. As long as you knew the right people, you were all right. Sean was in truth a goon and a follower. His tastes and his intelligence hadn't developed beyond the adolescent stage. Like his friends, he had lived much of his adult life in a crowded cell. He had been the victim of constant bullying from his stepfather as a child, and had learned early on that violence and intimidation were the most effective ways of getting what you want, including respect. Alison had been frozen by fear, as is understandable. Many people present were of course feeling the same thing, but a righteous anger began to stir. Martin had demanded that everyone turn over their mobile phones to Gary and Sean. Everyone had complied, but when they came to Alison at last, she refused to hand over her device. Gary looked stunned at first before breaking into a smile and a little chuckle. Martin seemed surprised by the resistance too. He moved slowly towards Alison, his eyes fixed on hers. She bravely met his stare. Her scowling face could have made the devil think twice about messing with her. Martin sat on the table in front of her and cleared his throat in a deliberately loud fashion. He was about to speak, but Alison beat him to it, stating that her phone was her property, and he had no right to take it. Martin sighed heavily and began. Well, what do you know, folks? It looks like someone has got something to hide from the rest of us. Maybe she's got something to hide from you, Paul. Perhaps a secret black lover with a cock that looks like a baby's arm holding an apple. With this, Gary and Sean burst into fits of uncontrolled laughter. Judging by the stony faces of everyone else, there was no one else in the room who was amused by this. Get her phone, Gaz. Now, I'm genuinely curious to see what's on it. At Martin's command, Gary grabbed Alison's bag and ripped it out of her hands despite her best efforts to hold on. She began to weep as Gary emptied the contents of the bag all over the floor. As he went to pick up the phone, Paul jumped from his seat and came out swinging. Gary covered his head like a boxer under siege as Paul hit him with lefts and rights. Martin allowed this sideshow to carry on briefly before he decisively intervened, whacking Paul in the back of his skull with his gun. Paul collapsed to the floor. He had not been knocked out cold, but was clearly incapacitated. Alison screamed and rushed to her husband's side. She checked the back of his head for blood, but there was no cut. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his left arm was shaking violently. "Sit down, you stupid slag," said Clamp. "It was only a wee love tap I gave him." Martin then climbed up on the bar itself and started pacing back and forth. He folded his arms and tapped his gun against his left shoulder. He was becoming more animated all the time. "That was exciting, wasn't it? Sean, mate, why don't you take Benny boy a beer and see how he's getting on? Just a quick check. There's a good chap." Sean was quick to do as Clamp ordered. Sean found Ben sitting on a bin, smoking a roll-up. "Got you a beer, loser?" said the idiot. Ben asked what was going on inside. He had heard Alison scream. Sean assured him that there was nothing to worry about and the evening's fun was just getting started. Sean then reminded Ben why he was out here and not inside. The last thing he offered, Benny boy, before going back inside were not words, but a look. A look that said, "Know your place." Ben was the bottom bitch, and he knew it. It didn't have to stay this way, though. He didn't have to stay in this town. He didn't have to stay and stand guard by this door. But he was a coward. He was miserable. As soon as this reunion idea was put together by Martin and Gary, he knew he would be dragged along, and once he knew the details, he could see in his mind's eye how this was going to play out. He knew his role. His fantasies about jumping on a train and leaving Burton-upon-Trent behind him would never materialize. Back inside, Martin had turned his attention now on Elaine. She knew this would happen. Visions of her children were at the front of her mind. She couldn't bring herself to look at Martin Clamp's sick and twisted mug, even though he was sat right next to her. He put his arm around her. She shuddered and turned her head away, as she thought he might be starting to question her. Do you remember our little attempt at love-making back in the day, Elaine? I've had 1,000 fucks since, but do you know what? I've never forgotten that. Why did you lead me on the way you did? Do you know how humiliating it was for me? That day is burnt into my brain, Elaine. The sights, the smells, and the sounds. You did that to me, Elaine. You're a fucking witch, is what you are. But can I blame you, really? Females are disgusting creatures, in truth. Not all are aware how disgusting they actually are, but I think you're a wee bit smarter than your average slut, aren't you, sweetheart? You know you're a horrible cunt, don't you? Martin was not aware that Amy, who had surrendered her mobile like everyone else, had a more basic model backup phone, which she used for emergencies. This definitely qualified as an emergency. Martin carried on verbally abusing Elaine. Both Gary and Sean were focused in on this vile scene. Both were deriving great pleasure from watching this woman's anguish. Amy took out her backup tool, and with great calm and composure, she began sending a detailed text message to the police. As she was checking it over and getting ready to hit send, Gary loudly asked, "What the fuck is going on?" He moved on the nervous-looking woman and told her to show him her hands. Sophia put her hands on the table. In one hand, she held a nail file, one which looked like it could do some damage. Gary smiled at Sophia. "Were you going to stick me with that, my flower?" said the thug in a mocking tone. Sophia left the file on the table and moved her hands away from it. She then folded her arms in a defensive posture and looked down submissively. "Everything all right over there, Gaz?" asked Clamp, who now seemed to be getting agitated. "Yeah, no problems here," came the reply. "Then do me a favour and keep the fucking noise down, fat cunt," Martin snapped. Gary seemed angry and embarrassed by this exchange. He stormed behind the bar and helped himself to the bottle of scotch which had been sitting there and he'd been sneaking glances at since he arrived. He took a large gulp and shuddered. He stayed where he was, inspecting his blade while sulking. Martin had called Elaine many vile things. She had sat there and took it. She knew that if she said anything that might offend this maniac, then it could be the end of her. Maybe he would kill her friends too. He was becoming more and more agitated, though. Perhaps if she didn't say anything at all, he would kill her anyway. She looked over at Paul, who had recovered somewhat from the blow to the head he suffered earlier. She looked at Alison, who was softly weeping. Her friends were sat behind her, so she couldn't see them. Maybe it was just as well. She looked at Amy. She searched her mind through the fear and panic. Amy gave her a sympathetic and reassuring look. With this, a memory came back to her. She could remember Amy. She was a big girl back in the day, and she had been a clever sort. She was kind of shy too. Elaine might never have said a word to her in school, as if Somehow completely removed from the moment, this brought a small wave of sadness over her. Charlotte feared for her friend, but what could she do? If she spoke out now, she might get a bullet for her troubles. She felt a toxic mixture of fear, guilt, and disgust swimming in her guts and in her head. She sensed she was not alone. Martin was telling Elaine why, deep down, she hated herself more than she could ever hate him, when he was interrupted by Steve. Why don't you put the gun down for a couple of minutes and prove what a tough guy you really are? Steve almost immediately regretted asking such a thing. Martin turned around slowly and looked on Steve, regarding him as a crow might regard a worm. He then shouted, "Aussie, Aussie, Aussie!" Sean obligingly gave the oi, oi, oi. Martin stood up and paced the floor a bit before starting, "I don't think you really want me to put this piece down, mate, or hand it to Sean here." Steve was doing his best not to look petrified. Martin went on, "If I put this gun down, what do you think would happen next, Are you going to teach me a lesson, hero? Is that how you see this going, big man? Are you a fan of John Wayne? Or Charles Bronson, is it, mate, or is it Crocodile Dundee?" Sean began to giggle like a schoolboy. A stern look from Clamp quickly shut him down. "Do you think you're the only ones with problems? These last 20 years haven't exactly been a bed of fucking roses for me, you know." Elaine had found her voice. She now looked Martin Clamp straight in his eyes and took his measure. The words came flowing. "Last year, I buried my dad. He drank himself into an early grave. He cheated himself out of the best years of his life. And he took my mum's from her. I've had to bring up my kids, for the most part, on my own. I've made some stupid and shitty choices, but I've done the best for my children. They don't want for much. I've worked hard in one crappy job after another. I've never been able to save anything because whatever I do make goes to the landlord, or to pay the bills, or to feed and clothe my boys. My life isn't easy. But I can hold my head up and say, what little I have, I've earned it. Can you say that, Martin? What have you done these past 20 years? How many people have you hurt? And was it worth it? None of our lives are perfect. Maybe you had a really bad start, I don't know. What I do know is this isn't fair. We don't deserve to be treated like this. We're not your enemies. If you wanted to make us suffer, you've done just that. Please, Martin, let us go, or just walk away."